Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Zoom In Zoom Out podcast. The Zoom In Zoom Out podcast is about perspective, where three woefully underqualified friends, namely myself, Parth Behani and Aryan Chaudhary, speak to you about failure and perspective. And to make up for our lack of experience, we have on some very qualified guests, like we have today, Mr. Shayantan Rahman.
Mr. Shayantan Rahman went to Oxford for his undergrad in economics and then completed his MPhil in economics from Cambridge University. Right now, he works as a private consultant to both schools and students in India, and he's working with admission, schools, and anything that has to do with career development. He's also a volunteer with the Global Shapers community, which is an initiative of the World Economic Forum. And if that's not enough, he's got a lot of interesting stuff to talk to us about today. Thank you so much for joining us, Shanta.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for coming. Shayantan, let's start right away with talking about your college experience. You've had quite an interesting journey through both Oxford and Cambridge. Can you tell us a bit about how your first year was at college?
Sure. So basically, I was quite excited to go to Oxford, not just because it was Oxford, but because I'd spent a lot of years growing up in the UK. I'm actually British by nationality, and I'd only just spent the last few years of high school in India. But going into Oxford, I think one thing that I hadn't anticipated was that there would be so much to do. Now, again, the first few weeks were kind of intimidating. You're in a university that kind of looks more like a historical archive than a place you go to study. And for example, you expect professors to be pretty cool, but you don't expect your first week macroeconomics lecturer to be the former chief economist of the Bank of England. But all things aside, I definitely say that it was quite an adjustment in the first year, because coming from a very sort of rigid step-by-step Indian education system, going into more open-ended free thinking, and as some of you guys might know, Oxford still has that tutorial system where a lot of the classes are just you and one other student with a professor. So to sort of have your flaws highlighted in front of people who you are both intimidated and awed by is a pretty, life-changing experience, I would say. But yeah, I think sticking to the theme of what you guys wanted to explore with this podcast, I think my second term at university was my biggest learning experience. So while in the first term I adjusted, got involved in a lot of things, in my second term I feel like there was one sort of major experience that dominated that term. So that was when, right at the start of the term, I was approached by, a friend and a senior from another college within Oxford to run for the Secretary's Committee of the Oxford Union. Now, the Union is more known for being the oldest debating society on the planet, it's gone viral on YouTube with the Shashi Tharoor reparations video for viewers who aren't familiar. But basically, running for the union is just running for an administrative position within the society. Now, that might not seem like a big deal in the context of student societies, but the Oxford Union is an intensely political organization. A lot of former union politicians have gone on to become actual politicians. Like, think of Boris Johnson and Benazir Bhutto. But so it seemed like a really cool opportunity at the time. But because I lacked sort of an experience that, Oxford, with what Oxford culture was like around the union, in hindsight, I probably wouldn't have as readily agreed to it. So the reason for that is, when you run for election in the union, that becomes all you do every waking moment of your life. Because the way Oxford's structured is there are around 40 colleges, and every college has a certain number of union members. And if you're from a college that I was from, which was St. Edmund Hall, some of the colleges are incredibly anti-union because they're quite anti the union's sort of reputation for elitism. So if you're from one of those colleges like I was, it meant that you had to spend tons of time networking with people in other colleges and trying to convince them to go down and vote for you. And the second thing that makes it even worse is that technically, and this was a very stupid rule that I think has been reversed since, campaigning is illegal, was like against the union's rules and regulations. But obviously everyone did that, and essentially it was just a very unsavory process because it made the entire second term for me a very transactional thing where I was getting involved in things only if I thought it would let me network with people. And it also caused me to give up activities that I'd done in the previous term and I quite enjoyed. So like, for example, in my first term I took part in like the drama couples within Oxford, and then in my second term I just had to give up drama completely. And by the end of it, obviously, to top it all off, I didn't get elected. So it felt like 8 whole weeks were wasted. And so therefore, when I came back in for my second year, I was kind of resolved that I'd look at university as there are certain things I know I want out of it now that I know what's available. And that's all I'm going to focus on. And just make sure that I'm leaving college with basically no regrets. Obviously, beyond the union thing.
Definitely. And I think what you've explained out and drawn out for us is something that I'm sure a number of us will experience going into something like college, where you have a tendency to say yes to almost everything because you want to explore. So how do you recommend finding your priorities or things you should prioritize? Is it just trial and error, or do you have any other system that you would use for it?
Sure. So what I would say when you're looking at any university is it's not a one-size-fits-all process, nor is it designed to be one, right? Even if you look at, again, right now I work in the education and career space, so I can see it more and more with colleges, is that they're designed to offer experiences that you tailor to your preferences, right? But I think the biggest problem, and the problem that I faced as well, is when you're 18, you don't really know what your preferences are when you're going to be even 21 or 22. You kind of have to figure them out at college. So while I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, especially in your first year or first couple of semesters, to say yes to a lot of things, you kind of got to look at what it gives you, because the way you need to look at college is whether it advances your intellectual future, whether it advances your professional future, and whether it gives you an enriching social life. Because for a lot of people, myself included, college is probably the only time where you're surrounded by your intellectual equals on a whole. Because in school, the way I kind of tend to describe it is if you've been in the same school for many years, which unfortunately I haven't. I think I went to about 8 different schools. But if you've been in the same school for, say, a decade or so, you're basically friends because of some version of Stockholm Syndrome. Because you're trapped in the same room with 30 to 60 other kids for most of your waking hours. You've got to be friends with them. Whether you like them or not, you've got to be friends with them. Whereas at college, you're in much larger environments normally. And you get to pick who you want to spend time with and what you gain from them. And also, for example, if you're in a school where no one else has read a book, that's not going to happen in college. You're going to always be able to find people to learn something from. So even that social component of university is really important. So it's not just about, if I want to do a master's degree, let me just look for research assistantships and all the sort of research positions in academic societies as I want to do. Or, for example, and I think this really happens to the kids who are looking at, say, consulting and banking as jobs, as they spend pretty much every free minute of theirs in college applying for internships and insight days and networking on LinkedIn. But you have to take some form of community away from at least your undergraduate institution. Again, with master's courses, and I'll come to my Cambridge experience in a bit, if most of them are just a year long, if you're lucky if they're 2 years long. So you don't really have much time to sort of settle in and form a bond with people. And normally when you're in a master's course, everyone's a different age. Like, for example, at, say, 21, I was one of the youngest people on my master's course. The average age was around 25, and there were people who were in their mid-30s. So the people are at different stages in their lives when you're doing grad school.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And I think honestly, Ari and I have been talking about Berkeley clubs and opportunities for the last few weeks, and there's just so many that sound interesting. But yeah, it makes sense to for sure figure out what is it that we want to do with them, and then decide what all we could try.
Yeah, and also like Parth said, being incoming freshmen, we sometimes I think I sometimes face this tendency to just say yes to everything that's being offered to me, and I think you spoke a little bit about that. And this always brings me back to like this college triangle thing, which I really liked asking guests on this show. So I think you've heard about this triangle where you have enough enough sleep, good social life, and good grades, and you need to pick two in these three. What do you think about this triangle? Do you think this is true? Did this apply to you?
Yeah, I definitely think it did apply to me because I did want, a strong academic future for me when I came into university. And while this ultimately changed for me, my goal was always to do a master's after my undergrad. But I also wanted to have a social life, and basically my sleep did go out of the window. Like you do have to get used to the fact that your 8 hours can become 4 or 5. But I think one thing where at least my university's timetable was very helpful was that they, rather than having very long bursts, they split the year into basically 8 to 9 week terms, where basically you put your body through all sorts of hell for 8 weeks, and then you have a vacation where your first thing to do is sleep and catch up on all of that. And that was basically the model most students around me followed. I don't really think there was anyone I knew that was getting like a healthy amount of sleep. Because I think there's a version of the triangle that they use in the UK, especially at Oxford and Cambridge, where it says that you either leave college with a first, a blue, or a spouse. I mean, most of us leave with none of the three. But essentially, the principle is that you're either toiling for an academic position, or for getting on one of the university teams for the Cambridge match, which gets you a blue, which is just a blue blazer. And a spouse, I think, is self-explanatory. Though to be fair, one of my friends in college, I think, managed to graduate and ultimately get all three. So it's not that you have to choose, but I think we can describe those guys as unicorns.
Definitely, I think this sort of trade-off between work and sleep and actually having fun while you're at college is something that's very personal and that we're all going to have to deal with. And we spoke to you a little bit about how during your second year you were a lot more busy because there were so many things that were happening at the same time. And I'm sure these 4 or 5 hours of sleep was a massive part of that. Now, during that period, how did you manage your time, and how would you recommend others manage their time?
Right. So again, I would say I would use time management in the loosest form to describe my second year. It was more, there was always something urgent to resolve. So basically, at different points in my second year, I had a research assistantship with one of the researchers in the economics department. It was actually quite interesting. We were doing a behavioral economics experiment in Ethiopia, and I was just basically a data monkey for that. Then the other big project I had going on was that I actually, as an undergraduate, I won a research grant from BNY Mellon, so I had my own funding and team, and we had to conduct a research project that took us about a year to do. And it was completely funded by them, and it was pretty cool to be able to lead a research project as an undergraduate. On top of that, aside from classes, my major time commitment was to two different societies. So the first was the Economics and Management Society, which actually started at the beginning of my second year. And the second was the Oxford Guild, which is sort of like a careers and business society. But when I joined it, it was branching out into organizing speaker events. And while we started with relatively serious speakers like, CEOs or like the director of Human Rights Watch, by the end of my term there, we were branching out into Kanye West and Lil Jon. But no, but on organizing events for the guild, and we had to have a lot of socials for our sponsors, because one of the principles behind these societies is you normally have a corporate like, say, Deloitte or McKinsey sponsoring you in exchange for, say, their employees being at your social events to, say, recruit people for internships and graduate jobs. So organizing and making sure enough attendees were there, that was basically, a couple of hours a day of work whenever you had an event coming up, which was about weekly. Even with the Economic Society, getting the society off its ground, raising some funding, getting the business school to support us, and then, we had to organize events for the new economics and management freshmen and running that. And we got off to a good start because we had a few speaker events that got us a lot of traction, including we had like a couple of Nobel laureates come in and give lectures and stuff. So we had a strong start. And yeah, so that was what second year was about. The one thing I would say that I think might be different about my experience than others is Oxford has no consequential exams in second year. Like, all the exams you kind of give in second year are mocks, because they examine you only at the end of third year. So the only exams you have that count towards your degree happen at the end of third year. So you can afford to sort of cut corners in terms of how well prepared you are in second year and make up for it in third year, which is pretty much what everyone does.
But yeah, that's quite cool to hear about how by the time you came to your second year, you figured out more about what you wanted and what you could compromise on to get the experiences you needed. But also when we were talking to you, you told us about how initially you were leaning towards an academic path, but ended up, as you're now currently in industry. So that was a sort of similar parallel to one of our previous guests that we've had, Jin, and actually Kevin as well, right? So what drove you to come back to India and start the current company that you're running?
Around the time I was doing my master's, you had that whole edtech boom going on in India. So it seemed interesting, it seemed exciting, and even from my perspective, like coming to India for high school after doing middle school and primary school in a different country, you could pretty much see glaring issues with the education system here and with the one in the UK. It's not perfect there either. But also, as I walked into university, I genuinely felt that aside from memorization, I had developed zero academic skills over 4 years of Indian high school. So I felt that a lot of these edtech firms that were looking to work in adaptive learning, skill development, etc. would be cool to look into. So that sort of sparked my decision to come back to India and initially work in education. So I started off working in more of a consulting role. I didn't like currently I run CollegeLab. That didn't start till a few years after I'd moved back. So initially I was looking into sort of other roles, helping run companies that were starting new edtech projects, etc. And there was a fair bit of disillusionment at that stage because I wouldn't say regret, but I would say it was a really good learning experience because obviously sitting, at university, you're only really seeing what these companies are projecting either through press releases or through their own general, public relations.
Yeah.
But when you actually look at what's going on back end, you kind of see that the whole narrow-minded lack of, a care for the education industry has extended even to the private sector. And I was curious because then I started looking into the market style, and look, there are definitely quite a few people doing great work in this space, but the majority are snake oil salesmen. So that's when we started talking to schools and we canceled the contracts with, those clients, and basically started looking at first schools and looking at how schools were investing in career development and counseling. The answer is most of them weren't, and nor were they looking to. A couple of schools were, and I will give credit, especially big shout out to the Sri Ram schools in Delhi. They're doing amazing career development focused work from middle school onwards. But most of the other schools, barring a few in our sort of initial outreach group, were just basically looking at having one in-house career counselor that we would train or do something with. They weren't looking at, say, upskilling the students, making them ready to go abroad, dealing with the fact that a lot of Indian students really struggle. Like, say, if someone's a 99%er in school, they should be going on to the US and, being at a 3.9 plus GPA level, but that rarely happens. Because at the end of the day, we prepare kids for a very different skill set in 12th grade than they need going into the first year of college. So, and a lot of them weren't willing to listen. So that's when we started working with students directly and structuring mentorship programs. And even now, I know we're often labeled as college admissions advisors because that's what the sort of expectation that a lot of parents have. But even now, what we're really trying to do is work with 9th, 10th, and 11th graders and upskill them. I think we're one of the few counselors that currently doesn't take 12th grade students by default. So our process is a little more development oriented. And a lot of that comes from my experiences. I felt that my argumentation and writing skills were the same in 9th grade as they were in 12th grade. And while I was debating a lot and writing a lot, nothing is at a very high level. Because even if you look at, say, inter-school debates in India, they tend to stick to very esoteric moral topics while expecting kids to have no knowledge of literature or moral philosophy, etc. For example, very broad strokes topic, is money evil? Should the Industrial Revolution have been reversed? Stuff like that, which is just most 16-year-old children would just go on stage, shout, and hope that they get a prize for it. So we're trying to work differently on that. Exactly, yeah. So obviously it's not just me. We have other people on the team working on skills like that now. But yeah, so that's it's a combination of my experiences and learning from basically gaps and, frankly speaking, fault lines in the education system here. And yeah, while most of our students are fairly privileged kids who are going to end up abroad, like Arihant, let's be fair. But we are really working towards trying to spread this from a skills perspective. In fact, last year was the first year we had a few students join us despite having no intention of going abroad. They just wanted to go through the mentoring program. So, we count those as small victories for us as well.
That's honestly such an insane journey to think about, from working with professors during your undergrad to then shifting to some unethical companies, if I'm being sweet to them, in India, and then trying to consult with schools. I'm really curious to know about what were the challenges you faced while getting into this kind of counseling that you can consider like a niche, I think. Do you think there are some challenges that you
Definitely.
faced that made you learn some important lessons? Uh,
Definitely, yeah. So I think one of I think you're right. You can call it unethical or unscrupulous beforehand. I think when you want to, and I see a lot of students who are I want to run a startup, etc. I think I came into my experiences in India with a very British notion of startup culture, which is sort of young, well-educated, sort of Russell Group University graduates working on, highly skilled tech projects, etc. And then you come here and you see that a large part of it is dominated by, sources of wealth that don't really care about ethics as long as you make them money. So, you'd get business practices like differential pricing. We saw it with, one of the major things we struggled with initially was when we were trying to figure out a baseline market value for counseling. And we had we'd surveyed and we'd found individual firms that had a price sort of range between 4 lakhs if they thought you weren't too wealthy to like 35 lakhs if they thought you were loaded for what is essentially the same service. So I think that was a bit of a tough experience to understand how to position yourself as ethical. The second thing is obviously when you're starting off, I mean, I do think credentials help to an extent, but especially in the first year, when you're taking on a mentorship role for a teenager, a parent is basically putting their trust in you over their kid's future. So when you're in your 20s, a lot of parents might be very hesitant, especially when we were starting off, to basically trust us. So I think overcoming that just took time, honestly. Like, I would say in the first year, maybe half the parents we spoke to said, hey, sorry, you sound great, but you're too young. Whereas now I think no one says it because they've kind of seen our track record. So I think the major thing when you're setting up in a niche where there's a lot of other people is establishing yourself as having been around versus people who've been around for a while, is saying that despite my age or inexperience, I can still bring something to the table that others may not be able to.
Definitely, and I think that's really good advice, especially for people not only in this sphere but in any sphere, about setting yourself up and being consistent with your results in order to get people to see your actual abilities. And I want to move us a little bit into discussing the global shapers that Aryant mentioned when we were starting off. And to my understanding, Global Shapers is a largely social organization that helps people that are less privileged. So could you just tell us briefly about what work the Global Shapers does?
Sure. So essentially the Global Shapers started, I think, just under a couple of decades ago now. So it's led by this organization called the World Economic Forum. It's the same group that organizes the Davos Summit every year. So it's sort of a affiliate of that they kind of administer. But it's largely self-organized in that every city is supposed to have its own hub, with, say, 20 to 50 people selected to be part of that hub. And I think, there's thousands of cities that do. Like, we're not just talking big cities like Calcutta, Delhi, but even like Gaya has a hub now. So the objective of any hub is to basically use the SDGs, or like the Sustainable Development Goals, as a framework to affect change in the city that they're a part of. Now, I'd heard a lot about hubs in other cities that were doing amazing work, etc. So when I ended up with Calcutta as my sort of main base of operations, I thought it would be a great way to get to know people, because while I had spent some time there at the end of my schooling, I wasn't really very rooted to the city. So I thought it would be a great way to find a community of effective change makers. And again, some of the hubs do absolutely incredible work, and even some of the people in the Calcutta hub are really running impressive projects of their own. You don't have to be a social worker to join the hub, but the hub's projects have to be social. So my experience, I joined the hub around just before I started CollegeLab, actually around 2017. So what happened there was that basically, unlike other hubs, the Calcutta hub had basically 4 active people, including myself. And it was a largely dead hub. But again, me and the other 3, we started building momentum, trying to run it. And the idea was that as shapers, you age out by the time you're 30. So you do kind of get to a point where you have to hand over to like a new group of fresh-faced young people. So our goal was always to recruit, find good people to, build a culture of effectiveness. So, but what largely ended up happening was that we found 2 people, and out of maybe 50 people to 40 people that, applied to be, and we tested out, that actually ended up long term adding value to the projects. I mean, the projects the hub are running now, compared to being completely inactive when I joined, yeah, I'm quite proud of, because you've got people running the Calcutta Clean Air campaign. You've got some of the largest water conservation efforts in the city. You've got a lot of blood donation and climate, even during this whole the early stages of the lockdown. One of the shapers was part of like a feeding people campaign that he basically organized, and they were for over a month feeding about 13,000 people a day.
Oh wow!
So there are amazing individuals in the hub, but one of the things I felt that was my goal with the hub was to sort of build a network or a community of people affecting change. We found people that we already knew before the hub.
Yeah.
But I don't think as a hub we created anything beyond what we could have done in our individual capacities. So the value addition of just the Calcutta hub was only really the fact that it had the whole Global Shapers brand, etc. to it. And that has helped in the sense that, say, after Cyclone Amphan last year, we managed to raise for various like fundraising causes of over 10 or so lakhs very quickly for a lot of relief work. But yeah, it takes time to build a community like that. And I think the challenge with the Global Shapers was balancing, say, a big voluntary commitment like that and starting my own company was one where I do think the Global Shapers ended up suffering in the end.
In terms of what you were able to take away from the Global Shapers, and is there, and I'm sure which our listeners would have experienced as well if they've tried to involve themselves in any social venture, and I can definitely relate to what you're saying, but it's quite difficult getting people involved and getting them to actually understand the ethos of what you're trying to do and fully immerse themselves in it. Did you find that any skills you learned during trying to attract people for Global Shapers helped you build your team during CollegeLabs, or any general skills to attracting people?
I think one thing that I think simultaneously developed from Global Shapers and CollegeLab sort of being projects I was working on side by side was that there was a strong synergy between how a lot of the Global Shapers projects the people in the hub wanted to work on, and people with a lot more social experience than I did, were focused on impact in the long term over the short term. So one of the things that sort of translated between that perspective and my perspective with work is for us to also think about impact and how to manage it at scale. So for example, like last year we reached a standpoint where, obviously as a business we were doing well. We had a lot of students and parents wanting to get on board with us. And we took a call that we would set a hard cap on the number of students we'd take each year. And we do it on a basis which was essentially somewhat selective, but largely, first come, first served. If you met certain working style and academic parameters, we take you, and that's it for the year. And while obviously there were a lot of concerns about unfairness and lack of access to services, we realized that a large part of our service is based on having direct access to your mentor on a regular basis, and not, seeing them once and then not for 2 more months. And a lot of the skill development programs have very hard caps on them, so you can't teach them with, groups of 40 or 50 kids. It's easier to do in a more Socratic 6 to 10 person setting. So for us, even that was a big decision that piled on, was what kind of company do we want to be? Do we want to be the company that has the most families and schools and students working with us? Or do we want to have a reputation of just, say, working with a small niche but achieving a very long-term, value addition for those families? And then figuring out how to scale slowly rather than quickly.
Yeah, well, that's quite interesting about figuring out what your identity is as a team and as an individual, both in terms of your company and in terms of Global Shapers. But also, with doing so many incredible things, do you ever still face productivity slumps, or just periods of time where you can't work?
Honestly, quite rarely. I do think that generally, I think my college experience was where I started figuring that out. And one of the major things I sort of shifted my focus to was, rather than focusing on daily goals, was to start focusing on weekly and monthly projects. So that, because I feel like initially, if you look at a lot of these like techniques like bullet journaling and stuff, they're focused on quite at the most granular level, they're focused on setting a daily set of targets and hitting them, right? What I figured is that can actually be quite a demotivating process, because when you're the night before or the morning of, or whenever you set these daily targets, you have a tendency to estimate that if you have 6 hours of availability, you're gonna do everything in those 6 hours. Whereas with monthly targeting, it made it easier to know what your priorities are each month. So say, for example, if my priorities for this month are to, so mentor my kids to start like a science club or an economics club, and I also need to side by side work on, some kind of like presentation or collaboration with some university, I won't set them as a daily target. I'll set them as a sort of weekly target, because especially when you're working, your schedule is inherently unpredictable. But you'll find that if you average it out over a certain period of time, depending on your work situation, you can manage a constant time over a week. Now, it might be 4 hours on one day, nothing on another, or it might be 1 hour every day over 4 days. But it's easier to set longer term targets. And the other major thing is build in downtime. I do find myself very frequently working, 16, 17-hour days, especially in, certain busy periods for us. But it's also built in with the fact that it can't go on for too many days in a row. So you've got to build in a cutoff day where, your phone is not accessible. And the other thing I think is managing your relationship with technology. Generally, like, for example, I do spend a fair bit of time customizing my notifications, my devices, so that I don't get them when I don't want to receive them. So things like that, or just setting, rules with whenever you get busy, it's distractions that you have to manage, right? And now most of our distractions are notifications. And that was also the major thing I would do in college, is that, say, a lot of friends, I think, struggle with productivity because you're allowed to take your phones and devices into the library, etc. I'd always liked the libraries with lockers, where you could just put your stuff away in the locker and sit with the books. I do think that's becoming harder and harder at college, because colleges are moving to digital textbooks, digital resources, etc. But it's a habit I've been developing since college, because for me the major thing is, I know I have I have tendencies to get distracted very easily, and it's been a thing since, middle school for me, where due to whatever learning styles and difficulties that I have, I need to adjust my workspace. So I think developing those habits have been pretty useful. And secondly, a large part of it is, so both of my parents are doctors, so they've had fairly good tips about how to approach discipline and learning in their own way.
Yeah, it's been so nice to listen to your phenomenal journey from a student at Oxbridge to then a professional. You've gone through so much in your life already. Do you think you have any advice or a parting message for our listeners?
I think the major advice I'd have is, whenever you're choosing what to do, first figure out what you're going to get out of it. It makes it easier, because a lot of things seem exciting to experience, but maybe that experience is not as memorable as it will be in hindsight. So the major thing is, whenever an opportunity presents itself, take your time to think whether it's going to be a good experience for you when you remember it, rather than just when you do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shayantan. I think one of the key takeaways for me was the whole theme of finding your identity, be it in prioritizing things in college, or be it in your professional goals, or building your own team, or setting your boundaries with tech. And I think that's something that definitely all of us can really use and relate to. But yeah, again, thank you so much for being here with us. And for our listeners, we'll be linking Shayantan's resume and his email ID in our podcast. So if you want to get in touch with him, shoot him an email, not a WhatsApp text. And we hope you keep listening to us, and we'd obviously be happy to have any feedback. So thank you, and bye.